Normally we hold this webinar series on every Friday, mostly around 4 o'clock, but this being very, very special, and rural economy draws attention of most of the authors, academician, policy maker, and there is a cogent reason for this. In 2020, 22, 23, 60% of Indian population lives in the rural area, and 47% of population is dependent on agriculture for livelihood. Contrary to the common perception about the predominance of agriculture in the rural economy, about two-thirds of rural income is now generated in non-agriculture activities. The agriculture sector has grown at an average annual growth rate of 4 to 6% in the past 6 years. The panel shall discuss the rural economy of India and lay down the roadmap of its improvement. So before we start and I give the floor to the chair, let me have the proud privilege of introducing Professor Mahendra, the Director and Vice Chancellor of Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, that is IGIDR, in Mumbai since 2010. Previously, he also served as chairman of the Commission for Agriculture Cost and Prices from 2018 to 2020, and was an independent director at Kotak Mahindra Bank from 2013 to 2021. He is a vice chairman of Board of Trustee at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, and has held various roles in national committees, including the National Statistical Commission and the Prime Minister's Task Force on Employment. He has published around 200 research articles and 19 books, including Inclusive Growth in India and Perspective on the Equitable Development. His expertise covers agriculture, rural economy, and development economics. He received his PhD from the Delhi School of Economics and conducted postdoctoral research at Yale University.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Yeah, he had consulted the organization like UNDP and the World Bank, and has received several awards for his contribution to education and public service, including an honorary doctorate from Acharya Nagarjunan University. He is currently a member of Audit Committee and Special Committee of the Board of Directors of Monitoring Large Value Frauds at Kotak Mahindra Bank. Now, I just briefly introduce Dr. Pattanaik. Dr. Sitikantha Pattanaik is Chief Economist, NABARD, and former Executive Director, RBI. Prior to being promoted as ED, Dr. Pattanaik was an advisor in the government of in the Department of Economics and Policy Research of RBI. Dr. Pattanaik has, over a span of 3 decades, worked in the area of economic research and monetary policy in RBI, Monetary Policy Department, and Department of Economic and Policy Research. He was with the Central Bank of Oman on deputation from RBI for about 5 years. As Executive Director, Dr. Pattanaik will look after the Department of Economics and Policy Research. So, floor is yours to over to the chairman, Professor Mahendra.
Thank you, Dr. Visalas. Good afternoon and welcome to this EGROW webinar on state of the rural economy. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Charan Singh, Dr. Visalas, and EGROW Foundation for inviting me for this webinar. So the EGROW webinar series are very good with high quality, and people look forward to these webinars. Today's speaker is Dr. Sitikantha Pattanaik. Already he was introduced by Dr. Visalas. He's the Chief Economist at NABARD and former Executive Director, RBI. So he will be speaking on the state of the rural economy based on the NABARD surveys. But I will say a few words on the topic before I hand over to him. I will talk more generally because he will give lots of statistics and other things based on the surveys. So rural India constitutes around 46% of GDP and 70% of total employment and population. Agriculture and rural growth is important for creating demand for overall economy, including manufacturing and services. We need demand that can come mostly from agriculture, because 70% are dependent on, employment particularly are dependent. So this is also important for inclusive growth, as many people are dependent on agriculture and rural activities. If you see the expenditure elasticities, for goods and services, they're higher for the bottom 50% in rural areas compared to the richer classes in urban areas. Because richer classes, they consume the goods and services which are different. So when income increases, what happens that richer classes tend to save more, while the rural bottom 50% spend more. When income rises, these classes, bottom rural classes, spend more on food, non-food goods, including durable and non-durable consumer goods. So therefore, agriculture and rural-led growth is important for enhancing a broad-based growth. So agriculture has done well in recent years, including COVID time. In fact, last 5 years growth, including COVID time, the growth rate of agriculture was 4.2% per annum. Only last year we had lower growth of agriculture, 1.4%. So this year again, we expect a 4% growth or more because of good monsoons, etc. Similarly, rural non-farm growth, as mentioned earlier, rural non-farm sector is also important. It is also increasing. If you see employment as well as share in rural areas, that is also important for demand for goods and services. Agriculture has much more potential for growth. It's doing well, but so we have to reimagine agriculture. So we have to work on growth, inclusion and sustainability, because inclusion and sustainability are equally important. So on growth, diversification of agriculture, better remunerative prices and rise in farm incomes. The marketing and trade reforms, we have, in consultation with states. Can you please mute yourself? Can you please mute? Yeah. So the marketing and trade reforms we have to do in consultation with states, because marketing reforms are important, but it has to be, we have to consult the states, and reorienting subsidies to investments. And also we should not forget basics like water, credit, R&D, because our expenditure on R&D is one of the lowest among the countries in agriculture. And of course, technology one has to be important. But one thing it's becoming important is the post-harvest infrastructure. The warehousing and value chains. These are becoming much more important, because as RBI study showed that out of the consumer's prices, suppose consumer price is 100 rupees, the farmers are getting only 30% in many of the commodities. So that's why this efficient value chains will help the farmers and the consumers. And of course, digital technology, the precision farming, and now AI and ML. So on inclusive growth, of course, because India has 86% of them are small farmers. So we have to have FPOs, and they organize themselves. And also nutrition is also becoming important. Nutrition crops. For example, MS Swaminathan calls the coarse cereal grains as nutrition crops, the millets. Similarly, sustainability, climate resilience is also required. Of course, in some cases, encouragement to natural farming may also be needed. Similarly, in rural areas, investment in infrastructure, connectivity, digitalization, internet, the financial inclusion, financial services like savings, credit, insurance are also required. Similarly, inflation control is also needed for rural consumers. In fact, I don't know whether you know, more than 50% of the MSMEs are in rural areas. So we have to increase their incomes and productivity in order to have higher rural growth. Yesterday, Nobel Prize for Economics was announced for their work on why nations fail and succeed. So they say societal institutions are the difference between failure and success. Therefore, institutions are important for agriculture and rural growth. And in a vast country like India, we must look at state level. These are because there are large interregional variations in agriculture, the cropping patterns, also rural non-farm sectors in both rural and agriculture. And agriculture is a state subject. So therefore, we have to work with the states. And lastly, of course, this webinar is based on recent surveys of NABARD. The first one, All India Rural Financial Inclusion Survey. It's called NAFIS 2021-22. Earlier survey was 2015-16. So Mr. Pattanaik will compare these two surveys. And second one is bi-monthly survey of rural economic conditions and sentiments. So based on this and some other data like PLFS on employment, the speaker will give presentation on state of rural economy in India. So I do not want to give details, but flag 1 or 2 points. So in general, 2021-22 is a COVID year. In spite of COVID year, the incomes and expenditures, access to institutional finance, financial inclusion and insurance for both agriculture households and other rural households increased significantly in 2021-22 compared to 2015-16. Of course, debt levels also have increased for these households. So with the policies mentioned above, we can improve the incomes of rural households. India wants to be a developed country by 2047. So without improvement in agriculture and rural growth, we cannot achieve this goal. So with this, I invite Dr. Pattanaik to make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dev. Good afternoon all. At the outset, I must thank EGROW Foundation, Dr. Charan Singh and Dr. Vishwandas for organizing this. The context, as Professor Dev mentioned, is the 2 surveys which were released last week. One is a comprehensive survey which tells us what exactly happened to the rural economy in the post-COVID period. And the second one is more current. It is a bi-monthly survey which will give us a regular update now on the state of the rural economy and also the sentiments or expectations of rural households. So let me share the PPT. I hope it's visible.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay. So what I will do, I'll first cover some of the key findings of both the surveys. Then I will use also the information that is already available on the rural economy from other surveys and other high frequency data. Then together at the end, maybe I would like to draw certain inferences about what exactly is happening to rural economy now and what are the key challenges. So starting with the first survey, which is NAFIS, some of you might have used also the NABARD All India Rural Financial Inclusion Survey findings or data for your earlier research. It was released in 2018, but the period it covered was the agricultural year 2016-17. So compared to the last survey, this time the coverage is much larger. It is 1 lakh households and covering 700 districts. So in that sense, only the consumption expenditure survey, its coverage is more than 1 lakh, which is 1,55,000 for consumption expenditure survey. And all other surveys, whether it is PLFS, All India Data and Investment Survey, then situation assessment survey, the coverage of rural there is around maybe 55 to 70,000. So the second NAFI survey in that sense has a much larger coverage. And the unique feature of this particular survey is that it covers almost all the major indicators we require to make a realistic assessment of the state of the rural economy. It covers major economic indicators like income, consumption, expenditure, savings, debt, and investment. There are many other surveys from which we could get information, say like consumption expenditure survey will give us information on consumption expenditure. PLFS may give us information on earnings. Similarly, AIDS will give us information on debt and investment, and also situation assessment survey will give us information, but relating to only agricultural households. The other aspect which also it covers is financial inclusion. All the major parameters of financial inclusion are covered in this, which is consistent with the 5-year strategy for financial inclusion used by RBI. So in that sense, it covers banking, insurance, pension, and even the digital infrastructure and the penetration of digital modes of payments in the financial sector. And another important aspect also which it covers is the status on financial literacy. So if we see the major parameters which are required to make an assessment of the real economy relating to the rural economy, the average monthly income, which is a key component, it has increased. The left-hand side, the blue shaded part is telling for all households, all rural households. And the right-hand side, we are presenting for agricultural households and non-agricultural households separately, because that also is a unique feature of this particular survey. So what we find, as Professor Mahendra just mentioned, the rural economy, if we see CAGR for agri households and non-agri households, and this survey was conducted in the post-COVID period. By that time, all the 3 waves of COVID were over. So essentially, the discussions we have in the press or maybe in the other circles also about what happened to the rural economy based on some anecdotal facts, that we can now verify because that this information is available now. So during this 5-year period, the average nominal GDP growth was 9%. But we find that the rural economy, agricultural households and non-agricultural households, their average monthly income also registered growth on par with the overall nominal GDP growth. And more importantly, if we see the expenditure side, that is monthly expenditure CAGR is little higher, which is 10.4% for agri households and 11.1% for non-agri households. So one point I think has been noticed by press is that expenditure growth was marginally higher than income growth. So how exactly this higher expenditure growth was funded? And second thing, what happened to the overall macro consistency in terms of income minus expenditure is equal to savings. So if we see that if monthly average income is around 12,698 and monthly expenditure is around 11,262, so they are clearly saving something. And we'll see in the next slide whether that number is consistent with the average saving numbers we are getting from this survey. And second thing, what before releasing this survey we did is that we checked whatever is the average income number or expenditure number we're getting from other surveys. These numbers are very close to that. So if we see the household savings, there is a major increase in the percentage of households who reported that they are saving now. Excuse me. I think 50.6% of the households who reported in the last survey that they save. This time, 65.6% of the households reported that they actually save every year. And the previous slide, I reported monthly income and monthly expenditure, but unlike income and expenditure, savings could be a volatile number if we take that on a monthly basis. So what we're presenting here is the annual average savings. And here also we find that household savings increased, but consistent with the national macro level data that we get on income, expenditure and savings, here also we find that the overall average saving rate growth is CAGR is 7.7. So expenditure growth is marginally higher than income growth. Income growth is consistent with the overall nominal GDP growth, and saving growth is marginally lower than growth in both income and expenditure. So if we see the investment, because there has generally been an argument based on again macro level data that many of the households actually borrowed, but they created physical assets, so investment went up. So what we find here is that compared to the last survey, more number of households reported that they're actually investing, both agricultural households and non-agri households, and this will include not only investment in plants and machineries, but also maybe acquisition of real estate or maybe investment in land. So what we found in this survey is that investment actually, if we take CAGR, it increased by almost 17%. So it is also quite consistent with the macro trends that are emerging, that financial savings may not be growing at the pace which is consistent with the income growth. But if we take the investment side, clearly that is growing at a faster pace. If we say the household debt, this has been widely reported, I think in almost all the newspapers, that the number of households who reported to be having debt has increased. Earlier 47.4% had debt, this time 52%. And one thing which is important to notice, again in terms of consistency with macro data, the average debt level, this is average for every household. That means we have taken all households as the base. That has not gone up substantially, even though the percentage of households who reported to be having debt increased, but the average level of debt has not increased. And we must also keep in perspective here the fact that after this particular survey, NAFIS 1, 2017 and 18, we had large scale farm debt waivers, almost aggregating to more than 2 trillion. And also the survey was conducted in the post-COVID period, where we had first moratorium and then restructuring. So the average debt numbers and also the average borrowing numbers in the next slide, we must make an assessment keeping these developments also keeping in perspective. Coming to household borrowings, this is the number of households or percentage of households who borrowed during the year. That means the year preceding the period when the survey was conducted. So again, this was a post-COVID period, and that is the time actually the amount of stimulus which was available from the government was quite substantial. So here again, the assessment of what percentage of households borrowed in the post-COVID period, some bit of adjustment at least must be done, keeping in perspective how much of transfers might have happened during that period. Somebody is mentioning that the slide has not changed. I'm presenting household borrowings. Is this the right slide?
The graphs are not coming. You've got a chart only. That
Which
came
slide?
momentarily disappeared again. Those bar charts you were showing.
Now it looks okay. Household with debt, no? Percentage with
Yes.
household. Yeah.
So next one I was presenting household borrowings.
Yeah. Loans.
So another important aspect from the standpoint of financial inclusion is percentage of households who are borrowing from non-institutional sources. So the left-hand side chart is for agricultural households and the right-hand side is for non-agricultural households. So here what we find is that those who are taking from only non-institutional sources, their share was 30% earlier, which has come down to 23.4%. And this 30.3% is almost very close to the number we had earlier from AIDS and Situation Assessment Survey. And this being a very important information, this I will come back to this when I come to the findings of the bi-monthly survey. Kisan credit card has been one of the prime instruments of financial inclusion. And if we see here compared to the last survey, a large percentage of households are now reporting that they have access to KCC. And another important thing in terms of access to credit for small and marginal farmers, if we see the different bars here, they are relating to different land holding sites. So the first one is for less than 0.01 hectare, and the next one is for 0.01 to 0.40 hectare. So there also we find that in the 5-year period, there has been an improvement in terms of access to KCC. But for those who are having more than 0.41 hectares of land, for them the increase is much more. Comparatively, it's much more. Another important information which is generally examined on a regular basis for macro analysis is the share of food in the consumption basket. So the left-hand side is the first survey, which is NAFIS 1. What was the share of food in the total consumption of the households? And the right-hand side is the current survey. So what we find from the current survey is that the average percentage of expenditure on food is around 47%, which is very close to the consumption expenditure survey number of 46.3%. It shows that large surveys are more or less revealing almost similar information. And the right-hand side chart also tells us that if we take it for all sizes, that means all categories of land holding, and for different categories of land holding, then also the share of food remains pretty high. It is only for those who are having more than 2 hectares of land, maybe relatively well up. For them, the share of food is 42%. Coming to other aspects of financial inclusion, the insurance coverage, it covers all different types of insurance which we have mentioned in the middle chart, which is life insurance, accident insurance, health insurance, and vehicle insurance. So the households having at least one member, one insurance, that has gone up substantially from 25.5% to 80.3%. But this increase is largely on account of vehicle insurance, because where I think it's compulsory. But in case of life insurance and accident insurance and health insurance also, we find over the last 5 years considerable improvement. One area which continues to be a concern is the penetration of crop insurance. There is an improvement here from around 7% to 10.8% of the agri households reporting having crop insurance, but more needs to be done on that front. Coming to pension coverage, it covers all different types of pension: old age, family, retirement, and disability pension schemes. So here we find that the percentage of households who reported having some coverage of pension that has gone up from 18.9% to 23.5%. Some of the factual things I am covering very fast, because the intention is to come to the major information that we have from the next survey and macro level data, which will help us in understanding the state of the rural economy maybe a little better. This particular information from NAFIS 1 and NAFIS 2 could be particularly useful when we use high frequency indicators, monthly indicators, to draw inferences on what may be happening to the last month's state of rural demand. There is a distinct shift in terms of the sources of income. Like last time, only about 1/5 or 20% of average income, because as I showed in the first slide, the average monthly income is around 12,698. So about 20% of income is accruing from cultivation. But there is considerable increase from two heads. One is livestock rearing and other enterprises. These are all small businesses. So their shares have increased. So if the first three we take as self-employment clearly, then earlier the self-employment maybe in 2016-17 was around 31%. That has gone up to about 42%. But there is also a major shift within labor income. Because earlier it was wage labor which was accounting for the major share of average monthly income, which was 43%. But if we see that now, that has dropped to 20%. And the share which is coming from salaried employment, which is from both private sector and public sector, that has gone up substantially. So even though 29% of the households only reported that some member in the household having some regular income, and also many of the households reported having two sources of income, three sources of income, and even four sources of income. So what is very clear from here is that if non-farm employment is doing well, then rural income is rising. And during this period, even though this was the post-COVID period for this survey, this particular segment did pretty well. So when I come to the composite indicator of rural demand, maybe it will be better to relate those high frequency indicators to this particular table. In terms of consumer preference, now there is a distinct shift in favor of consumer durables. Compared to the last survey, the penetration of television, mobile phones, two-wheelers, refrigerators have clearly increased for both agri households and non-agri households. And maybe in future, the penetration also will increase for computers and laptops. And what is more important from the standpoint of enhancing productivity in agriculture is the agricultural households, whether they're owning tractors, power tillers, threshers, harvesters. Here, the percent of households reporting that is very low. In case of, there is improvement in all the indicators we have taken there. But even in case of tractors, maybe 9.1% of the households, agri households, reported having tractors. But here it is not necessary that every agri household or agri farmer must be having all these appliances. So here the collectivization initiatives, they must work. I think there is some bit of progress there also. So that is also reported in the survey. It's a very detailed report, so I'm not presenting all facts. But the major conclusion one could draw from this particular right-hand side chart is collectivization is the way going ahead if we have to improve productivity through use of these modern appliances in agriculture. Coming to another area of concern, it has been reported earlier also in the situation assessment survey, the land fragmentation that continues because the average size of land owned by households, it declined further from 1 hectare during 2016-17 to 0.7 hectare. Here again, land pooling is an option. China went for a very different way to pool land, and there the collectivization certainly helped in achieving scale economies there. So what could be done here in terms of pooling of land to enhance productivity? That will remain a research question for us. Several aspects of financial inclusion, particularly financial attitude, financial knowledge, and financial behavior, covering many aspects under these three parameters were studied in the survey. So I am presenting here only one dimension, which is financial behavior, because that is important to financial stability. Financial behavior examines various ways in which the households manage their money, make financial decisions, keep a tab on their expenses, and maintain timeliness in terms of paying bills. So here there is a clear improvement. 72.8% of households were assessed as per the survey to be having sound financial behavior. So that may also help in improving the credit culture in the rural economy. So now I'm moving to the second survey, which is a bi-monthly survey. And unlike NAFIS, where the coverage is very large, because that it is the focus here is to have high frequency information on what is happening to the rural economy, both backward looking and forward looking. So that is why the coverages should be representative. So after discussions, we first conducted a pilot survey because some of you would know that NABARD has its offices in most of the districts. So using our district level officers, we conducted the survey. Each officer conducted maybe, they approached some 10 to 15 households. So based on the pilot survey only, we designed the questionnaire and also decided on the sample frame. And I would say that we are covering almost the major NSS regions, 80 NSS regions, 160 districts, 600 villages, and around 10 households per village. So that is the sample size. I'll start with their assessment about what happened to the rural economy last year. The survey was conducted in the last few days of September, last few days of August, and first few days of September. So when I say rural economic conditions in last 1 year, this is as per households what they reported, maybe for the period July, August of 2023-24. So 5 key parameters are again covered here. This is an assessment as per households reported: income, consumption expenditure, financial savings, borrowings or loans, and capital investment. So what we find here is that 37.6% of the households reported their income increased, whereas 80.1% of the households reported that their consumption expenditure increased. So if only 37.6% of the households are reporting that their income increased, how 80.1% of the households reported that their consumption increased? So the reconciliation could happen either from the financial saving side or from the borrowing side. So what we find here is exactly around 80% of the households, they reported either their savings decreased or their savings stagnated. So if we see income, consumption, expenditure, and financial savings together, then they clearly match. And to some extent, if we also see that 40.2% of the households reported that they are borrowing, but only 22.2% of them reported that they went for some real investment. That means some bit of borrowings also might have been used for consumption purposes. So if you see all these 5 variables together, from the growth standpoint, it is clearly consumption led, as we got it from NAFI survey also. And whether the information that we get in terms of what is happening to financial savings and borrowings, part of the borrowings going for consumption purpose, that is an imbalance. That could be an imbalance, but if the outlook is good for the economy, then some would say that for consumption smoothing, this type of behavior one may get occasionally. And that is why all these 5 variables need to be monitored on a bi-monthly basis to see what is happening to consumption and how exactly consumption is getting financed, whether from income side or through some moderation in financial savings and borrowings. Coming to the right-hand side chart, for the people, for the households who reported that their income increased, the median increase was 10% and the average increase was 13.9%. And here also for those households who reported that their income increased, we have presented the distribution. So almost 13.2% of the households, this 13.2 from this 37.6, they reported their income rising by more than 20%. So here left-hand side chart suggests that not everybody's income is rising. And the right-hand side chart shows that of those who are reporting that their income increased, there also is a distribution. And that distribution also could provide useful information for assessing the state of the rural economy. One of the issues, I think, when the consumption expenditure survey was released, they had imputed in terms of food and non-food, they get as pure transfers or subsidies from the government. So what we have done here is that we are taking such transfers, subsidies, which could be in the form of Garib Kalyan scheme, or it could be interest rate subventions, or even any other pension scheme, which is not regular pension. So what if we take all these into account, what percentage of average monthly income could be met from these transfers? Then one interesting finding of this survey is that almost about 10% of the average monthly income in the rural economy is now coming in the form of different transfers from the government. And if we see almost 9.8 or 10% of the households reported that these transfers are equivalent to more than 20% of their average monthly income. So it clearly shows that the intended benefits of these transfers are clearly being met, at least in terms of supplementing the income of rural households. The right-hand side chart presents how an average rural household uses the monthly income. So around 61% of average monthly income is spent on consumption. 13.4% is used for loan repayment, and 16.8% is used for financial savings. So when we get high frequency information based on this survey going ahead, one would be, I'm sure would be particularly keen to know how this blue part is changing, because this will give the current growth, because if it is consumption led, if it is remaining at 60 or if it is rising, then growth will certainly increase. But what happens to loan repayments and what happens to savings, that may provide some information about possible imbalances, and the interpretation of imbalances going ahead also, they have to be linked to some of the other variables which I will present. Coming to rural sentiment, because so far what I presented there in terms of what they experienced, and now they are revealing their sentiments. And here we have income and employment, how they perceive the conditions, income conditions and employment conditions to be in the next one quarter. Compared to the actual number, which was just maybe a little more than 1/3 in terms of increase in income, here we find that 54% of the households are optimistic there that they expect income to improve. And when we see this over the next 1 year period, then almost 70% of the rural households are expecting their income conditions to improve. And another important information one could notice from here is that how many are expecting the income situation to deteriorate or employment situation to deteriorate. So here it is just about 1/10 of the households, and here it is even lower than that. So this survey, of course, this survey has to stabilize. It will take 1 year to stabilize any high frequency survey. But going by this sentiment analysis, it appears that whatever has happened to the rural economy as of now, maybe up to September, things are likely to be better going ahead. Coming to share of food in monthly expenditure, as we know in the consumption expenditure survey, we got the share after 11 years. So what we are trying to do here is to get the information, at least for the rural economy, on a bi-monthly basis. What is the share of food in the consumption basket? So the left-hand side chart is taken from the consumption expenditure survey of past rounds. So in the rural areas, the share of food declined from 52.9 in 2011-12 to 46.38. And as I showed in the NAFI survey, that also got the number at 47%, which is very close to the consumption expenditure survey. But as we know, the share of expenditure on food is sensitive to also food prices. So if your food inflation is higher than core inflation, then it is quite possible that the share of expenditure spent on food may increase. And this is what actually we got in this survey, even though NAFIS was suggesting that 47% of expenditure is on food. Here we find that the median is 50% and mean is 52.4%. To make this finding comparable, we feel that it would be appropriate to take the average of 6 surveys, which will give the average share of food in 2000, maybe 24-25, and then to track whether it is comparable with the other surveys. Coming to current inflation perception of rural households, because we know that Reserve Bank of India conducts its own survey on inflation expectations, but that is for mostly urban areas. So this will be the survey which will be providing us information on inflation expectations of rural households. And in any inflation expectation survey, the most important information is inflation perception. Because if the inflation perception, that means what is the current inflation, if inflation perception is not very close to the actual inflation, then we know that inflation expectations 1 quarter ahead and 1 year ahead, they may not be very close to the actual inflation. So when the inflation expectation survey was conducted, that time the last inflation print which was available to the people and the households also in terms of public information was the rural inflation number for July, which was 4.1% headline inflation, and food inflation was 5.5. So even before we started the survey, we were expecting that the number should, if everybody is influenced by food inflation, then the expectations also should come close to 5.5, but otherwise it should come close to 4.1. So what we have presented here in the right hand side is the inflation perception. So we get the median number, which is 4%, that is very close to the headline inflation. And the average number, simple average, if we take that is 5.5%, the average number is very close to the food inflation number. And here also, if we see the distribution of households, around 5.5% of the households only reported that they perceive inflation to be more than 10%. But 75.2% of the households reported that the current inflation or their inflation perception is less than 5%. So the next slide presents inflation expectations for 1 quarter ahead, and the right hand side chart presents inflation expectations for 1 year ahead. So if you see the left hand side chart here, again median is coming to 4% and mean is coming to 5.4%. And the 1 year ahead, if we see, it is coming maybe 100 basis point higher than what we got for inflation perception and 1 quarter ahead inflation expectations. So 1 year going ahead, we clearly find that inflation expectations are about 100 basis point higher than current perception and also 1 quarter ahead inflation expectations. But in terms of the actual levels, the distribution around median and mean is certainly something which one must keep in perspective. But the median and mean numbers appear to be very close to the actual numbers. Subsequently, as we know, particularly in the month of September, the food inflation has gone up and also the headline inflation has gone up. So in the next round of the survey results, which will be releasing in November, that will be covering the period last few days of October and first few days of November. So from that survey, which will be released around maybe mid of November, we'll get to know how the inflation expectations have possibly changed because of the increase in actual inflation. Coming to rural credit market conditions, because the NAFI survey or the situation assessment survey, they are conducted once in every 5 years. So even though at the broad level, it tells us what may be happening to the dependence on non-institutional sources, this bi-monthly survey also collects information on institutional sources, only non-institutional sources, and those who take from institutional and non-institutional, and non-institutional will include friends and relatives and also money lenders. So what we find in the right hand side chart is that the average interest rate paid on loans taken from non-institutional sources, the mean is 17.4% and median is 12%. And there is also a distribution here, because maybe those who are taking loans from friends and relatives, it is interest free. And there is also a segment where the interest rate is less than 15%. These interest rates are all annualized. But there could be a segment, which is the right hand side, all the bars. So for maybe around 15 to 20% of the households who belong to this category, the interest rates may be more than 30%, in the range of 30 to more than 60%. We also had a question on rural infrastructure conditions, because NABARD's interventions in the rural areas is primarily in terms of creation of infrastructure. So in terms of sentiment expressed, 75.4% of the households reported that they find visible improvement in rural infrastructure conditions. And we also asked them to rank the top 3 areas where they clearly see the various initiatives which are being implemented where exactly they see clear improvement taking place. So here roads got the highest rank, and then followed by education, electricity, and drinking water facilities. So I'm coming now to the information that we already have. So in what sense these two surveys will be significantly strengthening the information base to make assessment of the real economy based on more recent data. So I think this has been already highlighted that the share of rural areas in net domestic product is 46.9%, so 47% only in the next revision. When we get the GDP, we'll know what is the share of rural, but we can sense that the pace at which it is declining over successive revisions, it would not have gone below 40% even when the next revision happens. And if we see in terms of sectoral shares, agriculture clearly 95.1% is rural. But one thing also we need to notice is that manufacturing is 51.3%, construction is 48.7%, and even services, almost 1/4 of our NDP is coming from rural areas. Coming to the significance of rural economy for employment generation, this is again for the comparable period 11-12 if we take. In total, employment generation was 70.9%, and subsequently, if we see the nice article by Professor Rameshan, it has gone up further. And if we see the recently released PLFS, which also provides information on the rural employment, 59.8% of rural employment happens in agriculture, followed by construction, where this is also quite labor intensive. So unlike the information we get on the significance of real economy in terms of share in NDP, share in employment, and also share in our CPI, 57% of our CPI basket, the current basket, is actually rural. But some people use the rural credit data to tell that no, the share of rural is not that high. So that is why when we are comparing data from different sources, it is very important to understand that the definition of rural followed by different agencies may not be uniform. For example, if we take the definition of rural used by RBI, it is a four-fold classification, which is metropolitan, urban, semi-urban, and rural. As a result of which the share of rural in bank credit is only 7.6%. We know that agricultural credit itself is much more than that. And over time also, if you see, the share of rural credit is hovering between 7 to 8%. So the definition of rural is absolutely important while working on data taken from different sources to make an assessment of the rural economy. Coming to what has been assessed, or at least it has been mentioned in some quarters, that rural economy was under stress and rural economy was not doing well. So if we take the consumption expenditure data, these are the levels in terms of average per capita consumption expenditure. The right-hand side chart presents nominal growth and real growth. So here, if you find the increase over 11-year period, then in the rural area, the nominal growth was 163.8% as against urban of 145.6%. And if we take CAGR, nominal CAGR was 9.2% as against urban of 8.5%. So here, based on consumption expenditure survey, there is no evidence that rural economy was not doing as well as the urban economy. And we also know that the inflation trends in rural and urban, they have been different. Occasionally they have diverged, more recently certainly. So if we take the real CAGR, here also we find that the rural economy growth CAGR was higher than the urban economy CAGR based on the consumption expenditure survey. So from expenditure, if we go now to earnings or income, this is taken from the PLFS. So PLFS April-June quarter of 2017-18 and now 2023-24. These are the actual levels. They give it for three categories: regular wage and salary earners, casual labor, and self-employment category. So if over this period we take the growth The green bars are for urban areas and yellow bars are for rural areas. Here also we find that the earnings growth as per PLFS itself, there is not much difference. Maybe rural over this 6-year period has been marginally lower than the urban areas, but one would say that they're very close. And if we take the rural CAGR for these three categories, they were 4.3, 8.1 and 5.0, whereas for urban areas, the CAGR was 5.7, 8.5, 5.4. So here also we find that earnings growth in rural area possibly was very close to what happened even in the urban areas. But as I said, what matters ultimately is real earnings. For the casual labor segment, clearly real wages increased, whereas for the other two categories, maybe real earnings declined, and that has been reported in the press also. But here, it is inflation which eroded the purchasing power of income. So here one macro issue is the importance of price stability to improve rural economic prosperity. This is again taken from PLF, is a known thing, and I think last week only in the same EGROW Foundation they had conducted a detailed discussion on this issue. But one important point here I will make is that the unemployment rate in rural area is lower than in urban areas, despite the fact that the labor force participation rate is much higher in the rural areas. There could be many issues surrounding the employment numbers, but maybe there is no time for that, so I'll move fast. So if we use the survey, which is annual survey of unincorporated sector enterprises, this essentially covers all enterprises, excluding agriculture and construction. So the focus essentially is on manufacturing, trade, and other services. And if we take the share of rural in GVA, it is only for unincorporated sector enterprises. The share of rural in GVA, the share of rural in employment, and the share of rural in total number of establishment. It looks like the share of rural is rising. So one would say that there is ruralization of the unorganized sector. So rural economy in that sense is going to be more important even going ahead. And if we see the GVA for establishment, then urban areas for establishment, they are certainly giving much higher GVA than rural areas. So the blue bars are for rural areas for manufacturing, trade, and other services. And this is for all. That means all activities excluding agriculture and construction, because this survey excludes agriculture and construction. So this also will be a challenge going ahead, because if productivity led growth will become important going ahead, then enhancing the productivity of the enterprises in the rural areas also will be important. Rural economy is converging to urban levels of development. This is also the most recent survey, which is comprehensive annual modular survey, which was released very recently on October 9th. So what it shows is that the percentage of persons with a bank account and percentage of households possessing telephone or mobile phone, the rural and urban area, they're almost similar in terms of penetration. There is hardly anything to see in terms of differences there. Even in terms of percentage of persons aged 21 to 35 years who graduated in science and technology among graduates, that number also, I think the convergence is very fast. But there are other areas where I think the convergence is required, which is percentage of households using clean fuel for cooking and percentage of households budgeting computer. So if we see in terms of the credit conditions, one important information for the rural economy is NPA. But as I told, the rural credit definition of RBI is very different from the definition used by other statistical agencies. So what I have taken here is from our own microfinance report. NABARD publishes one regular annual microfinance report. And if we see the loan disbursements to self-help groups and the NPA, we find that clearly every year the access to credit is increasing for self-help groups. And why I'm highlighting this, because collectivization is important in the agriculture sector. But the more important thing from the standpoint of making an assessment of rural stress is what is happening to NPAs, and the NPA is consistently declining. So even this information does not help anyway to come to the conclusion that the rural economy is under stress. Standard way to deal with information problem, because if we don't have information for the more recent period, then how exactly we'll come to a conclusion about the state of the rural economy? So what many market analysts do is that they monitor the high frequency indicators. So I have taken here the high frequency indicators. The first three are nominal, they are deflated by rural CPI inflation. So it is real rural wages, real agri credit, and real agri exports. This is terms of trade, because there has also been argument that terms of trade, if it moves in favor of agriculture, then that is good for rural economy. So that also is taken as a variable. The source here is WPI. Then employment non-agri and employment agri, because generally people use CMI monthly data. So that also is taken here. Current sentiment is taken from CMI. Then NAREGA, reserve oil levels, IIP food, fertilizer sales, tractor sales, and scooter sales. These are the major indicators which are monitored. But as we know, they are telling very heterogeneous story. So what we have done, instead of comparing month to month or year on year basis, we have taken the average for April to July of this year over average of April to July of last year. Even though the August data by last week they were available, I have not been able to update this particular chart. So as we know that many of these variables are actually highly correlated. So that's why if we use the principal component method, then just 4 principal components maybe explain close to 80% of the variation in the overall variation, or in terms of information content of these 13 variables. And which are those 4 factors? One is non-farm employment. So as I showed in case of Nafi's presentation, non-farm employment is very important in terms of making an assessment of source of income. Fertilizer demand, this helps us in making an assessment of what will happen to the farm sector income. Agri exports in terms of income that could be generated by exporting outside. And agri credit also, because as we know, part of the agri credit also is used for consumption. So these 4 variables clearly emerge as the 4 important factors. And when we combine these variables, we have presented at the left-hand side the composite indicator, which is not seasonally adjusted. As we know, each of these variables have very high degree of seasonality, and then seasonally adjusted composite indicator also. So the orange part, which is the seasonally adjusted part, it shows that the index is rising. So the growth momentum continues to be positive. And again, this is the last slide before I conclude. I think information traditionally taken from inflation has been very useful, because any price-based information is cleaner compared to any quantity-based information. And inflation also tells essentially about the imbalances that may be taking place in the economy. What we find here is that despite the high share of food in rural compared to urban, there is a high degree of co-movement between food inflation urban and food inflation rural. But consistently, the core rural inflation has remained above core urban inflation. As we know, the right-hand side food inflation is not essentially influenced by supply, but it is mostly supply and to some extent demand. And the left-hand side, one would presume that in the medium run, it is mostly demand, but in the short run, there could be spillovers from supply also. But if we find that over almost 4-year period, the core rural is remaining above core urban. So this also could be used to draw the inference that rural demand is clearly not doing anyway inferior to what may be happening to urban demand. So to conclude, the momentum of rural economic activity appears to have remained buoyant on the back of consumption expenditure, even though it is supported partly by income and partly by moderation in savings and increase in borrowings. most important thing that the perception which prevailed that in the post-COVID period, the rural economy stress must have increased substantially. That is not corroborated by the NAFIS data. In terms of sentiment, if we see how the households are thinking about future, then they seem to be upbeat about the employment and income conditions going ahead. In the interest of time, I'll stop here because those are all the micro details. So the essence of the story was what has happened to rural economy based on information already available. And if we use the information available from the two surveys, whether it helps us in enhancing our understanding of the state of the rural economy. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pattanaik, for an excellent presentation. Now, I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to highlight a few things, and then we'll open it up for maybe 15 minutes question and answers. So these two surveys are very useful. In the first one, NAFIS 2021-22, and the bi-monthly. I think bi-monthly, every 2 months, we get a very good source of data for this rural economy. So the first survey shows that a lot of improvements over the 25, 15, 16 survey. If we see income, savings, investment, the institutional share in finance, insurance, pension, all increased. Only thing is, of course, debt levels, the percentage of people taking are in debt, that slightly increased, but the levels are not much increase. Of course, average size of land also declined. Then one interesting thing is the sources of income, which highlighted. The wage labor that is declining, and the salaried employment that is increasing the percentage, and also self-employment, cultivation, the livestock, others are increasing. And it's also interesting, 10% of the monthly income is from transfers. That's also important indicator. On sentiments also, income and next 1 year and all, they're saying good improvements. 70% they may increase. Some inflation expectations, of course, there is some next 1 year slightly higher thing. On the also the rural urban are converging in consumption. That's also an important one. And also people said rural infrastructure also has improved over time, particularly roads and other things. One worrying thing, of course, wages for casual labor increased, but self-employed and regular, it has not improved. So on the whole, it's a very good presentation, and then these two sources will be very useful for researchers, policymakers, and all. So now with this, I open for questions now. Yeah.
May I ask, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Dr. Ashok, and next Dr. Mahendra Reddy.
Yeah, it was an excellent presentation, Dr. Pattanaik ji. It was and very, very captivating. Very two small questions. One is you found no evidence of the two-speed growth pattern, and to me it looks like a counterintuitive. And what is your take and why it is happening? That is one. Second, this rural demand is lagging behind the urban, and that is not supported by the inflation figures. How do you interpret this? So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. The objective behind this presentation, as you yourself mentioned at the beginning, to present the two surveys so that we have more information, and in that process, maybe we can make more sensible inferences. What I'm saying is that it is not possible from NAFIS to check anything about two-speed growth. Where NAFIS is entirely about rural economy, and the bi-monthly survey also is for the rural economy. So what I did there, I compared the nominal GDP growth, whatever happened during those 5 years, and what happened to rural consumption expenditure growth and rural income growth. So they were in sync. So that can help us only inferring that rural economy was not doing worse than the headline economy. But to corroborate that, what I did, I used the PLFS earnings data and consumption expenditure consumption data. So what consumption expenditure data, which is again NSO data, that also tells that the CAGR of nominal or real consumption was higher than urban. And because that consumption is a key component of GDP and a large part of growth essentially comes also from consumption, so that I used to derive the inference that there is no two-speed growth there. But I accepted also one point that compared to consumption, income growth has been marginally lower under those three categories if we take the information from PLFS. And there I think somebody has a question here, what about the role of inflation in rural income? And that's why I presented the last chart in that slide. So if those PLFS nominal earnings will deflate by CPI urban and CPI rural, clearly it appears that inflation is eroding the purchasing power of income. And that is why price stability must remain the key objective of any macro policy.
Yeah.
Dr.
Pattanaik, will you collect some questions and then probably you can answer to save time? Dr. Mahendra Reddy.
Sir, at the outset, I want to congratulate both Professor Mahendra Dev for his excellent introductory remarks and concluding remarks and your excellent presentation. I just have a couple of points. One is, I think, although it's not covered in the survey, I thought the lecture is going to be on the entire state of the rural economy, but it is focused. Now, whether startups is fundamental for Indian economy. And so it may be a good idea future to include something, some sense for startups and stand-ups in the Indian economy. My question is, there are about 30% of youth in rural India, according to the International Labour Organization, are unemployed. Now, fundamental question is of employment. And certainly, you have given fantastic information. 10% subsidies to the poor people. That's a very important information to get. But employment is a thing. But then the way in which you can't migrate to the urban, because urban unemployment is also high, and among the youth it is higher. So how do we face this challenge? What is it that we can do to improve the problem, to reduce unemployment? And the second point is energy thing also. You said it is much better in urban areas, but there's tremendous scope for solar and wind energies. Is there any way in which that can be initiated, because there's plenty of resource in the rural economy? Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Bes Barber. Yeah, you are on mute. You have to open.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, excellent presentation and very informative and insightful from both of you. This clarification to Dr. Pattanaik, you have mentioned importance of collectivization in the context of use of farm machineries and all that. I don't know what exactly you mean. Are you referring to those service centers kind of things that government is trying to set up in rural areas? But I'd like to bring in is one more thing, because you are chief economist of NABARD, is that the rental markets are also doing a great job, actually, particularly from my side of our research and all I found. So many are small farmers, so they basically hire the things, and there are very few big farmers. So if they own the machineries, they are not being able to fully utilize. So rental markets are also doing it. So maybe collectivization will be necessary, but then we need to note that the markets also need to be supported. I seek your clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, you have some in the chat box. probably one or two you can pick up and. Yeah, something on investment data over last decade for boosting rural economy. What about the investment data?
Okay.
Yeah.
All are very good question.
Yeah.
And I'll try to respond to some of them based on information. Coming to rural economy and employment conditions, as I said, I think the last week itself, there was a very detailed discussion on that. And the information that will be useful from these two surveys to help in terms of positive change that is taking place. One area of intervention I mentioned about KCC, Kisan Credit Card, how successful it has been. Because financial inclusion in the literature, empirical literature, we know that it is very important for enhancing the prospects of the rural economy. And that is very much visible from the information about KCC. Second thing also, one information which generally people discuss, but it was not available in terms of hard facts. Only over time, when we do the bi-monthly survey on a regular basis, maybe that will get validated over time. But what we find is that almost close to 10% of the average monthly income is coming as a support in the form of transfers from the government. So that is pretty high. So there are clearly new information available from both surveys that will help us in making an assessment of the positive change that is being brought about by public intervention. Also, there was a question on what should be the way to enhance the use of these agricultural machineries. You are right. I think I was referring to the custom hiring centers, because custom hiring centers are already in place. That is about collectivization. And in the report also, you will get information state-wise, in which states actually the use of these centers are more. It is completely economically unviable for small farmers or a few small farmers having a tractor, because maybe 10% of its capacity will be utilized and 90% will remain unutilized, even if it is used for both farming and marketing purposes and subsequently transportation purposes. So that is why pulling together the resources, and you also mentioned about developing the rental market. I think the rental market already exists. It's quite vibrant, even though it is an informal market. Based on the information that we get from many of the districts, this particular market exists and it is very vibrant. And I think on the same day, possibly the tractor is used in 3 different fields. And so the optimum use of resources available is very much there, but there is scope for enhancing the access of these things to small and marginal farmers on a large scale. If that happens, then clearly productivity will increase. So in terms of investment data, as I shared, the first survey, NAFIS, it collects information with a gap of 5 years, and that clearly shows the increase in investment in physical assets, and that may be an important information in the context of current debate, that financial savings are going down, but overall saving rate is not dropping very fast, because people may be borrowing or de-saving, and they are creating more real assets. So their saving is in the form of more physical assets. So this information also corroborates that. And to supplement that, what we are doing, if we have this bi-monthly survey, then every second month we'll get to know what percentage of rural households are borrowing and what percentage of rural households are actually investing in terms of creating new physical assets. So hopefully maybe after 1 year, once we have 6 data points, we'll know how this rural investment side based on survey data that might be changing during the course of the year. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Can I ask one?
Yeah,
Sir,
please.
Hello.
I'm Bhaskar Rao from
Yeah.
IDFAP. Sir, one question is I want to understand you said financial behavior has improved. How you measured that? That's the definition part. Another aspect perception me is the share of household income in a short span has changed from wage contribution 40% to 20% and salary contribution from 20 to 37% like that. It is really surprising to see that kind of transformation in this short span of time. Is it possible some of these household going distress migration and they're taking some employment like watchmen, this and that? I stop here. Thank you.
Sorry, I think I didn't get your first question. Could you please just tell one line on that? What was your first
How you
question?
define the financial behavior as improved?
Okay. So if you see the survey, because the report is already there in the public domain, so there are 25 questions. Each question is, I think, the three major categories which we studied, as I said, the aptitude, knowledge, and behavior. So based on available literature, for every question, they have fixed threshold values. So if your response is above that, then you are doing good. And if it is below that, then maybe you are not financially literate. So across 25 questions, they have aggregated. And then it is quite possible that somebody may be financially literate or has good knowledge, but behavior is not good. But that generally happens. That only those who are well informed, they possibly don't exhibit the sound credit culture. So these three aspects are studied separately based on these 25 questions, which are there in the report. And then a threshold is identified, a total score of 12, 13, 14. So what we did when we takes a combined threshold of 12, 13, and 14, the results are more or less similar. So that is how actually the assessment of financial literacy and also financial behavior has been made in the report. This is a very standard approach. There are many surveys internationally on making assessment of financial literacy and financial soundness. The same approach has exactly been used in this report in terms of methodology.
Yeah. So this is the last question, Subhash Chandra Agarwal, then we'll close. Yeah, please, you are on mute.
For the development of my village, native village. So I have a short question. If all the house owners start growing their own electricity in their own houses, will it help for self-consumption? Will it help in the economy of my native village?
I think that's a very good question, and the answer is yes. I'll tell the example of the department head of research in NABARD. He
Okay.
belongs to Rajasthan, a village, and he uses only solar power. He has no electricity connection,
Okay.
and he generates surplus. And also, I think those who are in deficit, maybe those who cannot afford possibly having solar units, so he also supplies to them. And he was telling me that in that village, many of the residents of that village, they are already doing that. And maybe half of them actually they are not going for any electricity connection.
Oh, very nice.
So if that can be replicated elsewhere, and government is also providing a large subsidy for adoption of solar units. So if the penetration increases, then that would clearly help in reducing our carbon emissions and also achieving the net zero target gradually. It will be through the participation of every farmer, each one of us, the net zero target will be achieved. And I think the change is very much visible. I know many of the NABARD officers, they actually not only discuss but also practice green lifestyles. I gave
Oh.
the example of basically some of the houses using solar units, not having electricity connections.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm also having solar at home.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, before handing
which-
over to Dr. Visamdas, I thank EGROW Foundation and Dr. Pattanaik for excellent presentation and all the participants for attending this excellent webinar. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So, all good things in life come to an end, and this is no exception. I'm meeting Professor Mahendra after a long time. We shared a few good moments when we were in Milan, and then in CACP. Also, in some sense, I was later succeeded him. So this is a very pleasant memory to get reconnected. But more important, academically, though he made brief intervention, but it was very, very pointed and it enriched the discussion. And Dr. Pattanaik, as usual, he was at his best, and we really it deepened our knowledge base, and it was very captivating. The presentation, the point he made, very fine point, very policy oriented and research backed information he shared with us. I'm sure all participants benefited, EGROW benefited, and everybody benefited. And let me also inform all our audience the recording of today's discussion and presentation will be ready by tomorrow afternoon, and then we'll be putting it on our website. And the gist of all this, we also sent to government, the concerned ministry, Niti Aayog, and so that they also get to know what is going on and what is the latest thinking. So with these few words, I once again thanks from core of my heart to Professor Mahendra, Dr. Pattanaik, and all the participants who are very, very busy, and but yet they make it a point to attend our webinar, and that really inspired us to upgrade and raise the bar of the level of discussion, enriching. And once again, thank you one and all, and to our participant also. Most of them, they asked very, very relevant questions, and we have taken note of all these questions, and some of the questions are not answered, but we'll try to answer later on because of paucity of the time. So thank you very much, and join us on the next Friday. The coming Friday at 4 o'clock, and we'll give the details of the all these details on our website. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Let me also mention here that
Yes.
there are many subject area experts here. I'm sure many of them would know much more about rural economy than I know. But the objective of the presentation was to add some more information to the information base which already exists, so that it can help us in making more realistic assessment of the rural economy. So I must thank all that they took so much of interest in the findings of these two surveys. I also must thank EGROW Foundation for this opportunity, and also Professor Mahendra for chairing the session and conducting the program so very well. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much.